Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is a show where we talk about technology and how a better understanding of it can help you have better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at Twit TV.
This is Twit.
Now, our first bite is the amazing backstory of the evolution of GPS. Now, Greg Milner does a great job in his New Yorker article here about the journey of GPS and its proliferation, but I also want to talk a little about the GPS technology and maybe even some of the dependency we have here, because I'll tell you one thing, GPS is ingrained within our daily lives, both personally and professionally, and when technology reaches a point like that, it becomes a target as well. Now, let's take the story back here to midnight June 20th of 2012. Now, that's when Todd Humphreys made the final preparations for his attack on the GPS system. Now, on a hill just a kilometer away, his team actually gathered around a flat metal box the size of a carry-on suitcase. Now, the electronic machinery inside the box was called a spoofer, and that was actually the weapon name. Now, soon a Hornet Mini, a drone-operated helicopter popular with law enforcement and rescue agencies, was scheduled to appear 40 feet above them. Then the spoofer would be put to test. Now, that's when they start talking about just how risky it is to use sometimes GPS, depending on the type of attack you have. Now, think about GPS. GPS is available for free to anyone in the world. There are 24 active GPS satellites orbiting in 20,000 kilometers, each emitting a radio signal containing a time code and a description of the satellite's exact position. Now, by measuring the transmission of time of the signal, a GPS receiver determines its distance from the satellite. Now, if the receiver does this simultaneously with the signals of at least 4 satellites in its line of sight, it can actually extrapolate its position in 3 dimensions. Now, during the roughly 67 milliseconds the signal takes to reach us, it grows exceedingly faint. So there's actually a problem there. The task of receiving the signal and extracting its information component is often compared to trying to read it using a light bulb in a different city, far away, right? Now, this system's core technology has remained the same since the first GPS satellite was launched in 1977, but its uses actually have proliferated at a really astonishing speed. Now, the reason the number of GPS receivers could double tomorrow without affecting the underlying infrastructure at all is just because of the timing part of it. Now, the GPS has been out for many years, and it's had some controversies as well. Now, this article goes into the history and the debate behind it, but I do want to go into the crucial components of GPS and just how a change in a disruption of service can actually have a domino effect on the world. Now, GPS is crucial to many different systems that are actually unrelated to geolocation systems. Now, because GPS clocks are actually synchronized to within nanoseconds, the network signals are used to actually unify time-dependent systems spread over large areas. Now, GPS time actually helps bounce calls between cellular towers, regulate power flows and electrical grids, and timestamp financial trades on major exchanges. Now, if a spoofer were to actually feed bad data or information that confuse the clocks in even a few nodes of these systems, the damage could actually be widespread. Actually, you have, as time errors multiply, communication systems would fail. Wrongly apportioned power flows could result in blackouts, and automated training programs could yank themselves out of the market, causing crashes. Now, those are just a few scenarios, to name a few. Now, we still have not figured out exactly how to safeguard technology that's so crucial yet so porous. But what this points out is we see consensus that GPS is wonderful, but we need to start cutting the habit on it, the dependency on it. Now, that's the first thing I want to talk about with everyone here, because it really is a problem that we depend on this a lot. Curtis, I want to throw this to you first. GPS is something that we both use personally and professionally, and we count it, we depend on it, but there's a failure point, right? There's a potential there to fail. Is this misguided trust in the technology?
Well, it's certainly a single point of failure for many different things. Interestingly enough, navigation, especially commercial navigation, may or may not see it as a single point of failure. There are, in fact, backup systems that are available, going all the way back to using a compass and sextant to find your locations. But for a lot of others, there is no way around it. It's used in too many, you mentioned time applications. There are an awful lot of encryption algorithms that are based on that mutually agreed upon time. There are all kinds of different location applications where they don't have the backups in place, and those go down to things like farmers making sure their crops are planted in nice straight rows, or crews grading surfaces where roads are going to be. So we have become amazingly dependent on the GPS technology just in a couple of decades. And it's going to be a rude surprise for lots and lots of industries if that ever goes away.
Right, right. Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this is, like you said, it does depend on, some of these technologies depend on the synchronized clocks. And I mentioned it a little bit, Cheaper. I want to throw this to you because obviously you've worked in networks for a very long time. And GPS is also a clock for most cell towers to actually coordinate calls and coordination. Is this something that they should be depending on here, especially with how viable and how how open they are to attacks?
Well, I think the reason why a lot of things are synchronized from the GPS clocks is because it's free. It's cheap, it's easy. I literally built a Stratum 1 NTP server. So I take the clock sync directly off the GPS constellation. And I built that for $65, really cheap. I don't have to buy something like a Symmetricon for like $4,000. And the cool thing is I can even build my own GPS antennas now. So when you start getting this kind of technology that accurate for that little money, you start getting some real widespread adoption. Now, our bacon isn't quite in the frying pan yet. Texas Instruments is supposed to be coming out. They've got it in beta and so forth. A new type of chip. It's a new clock chip. So NTP, Network Time Protocol, got started because the clocks in PCs have been notoriously horrible. I don't know if you remember the old days, your PC clock could potentially drift as much as an hour away from actual clock over a period of a year. So, bummer. Anyway, the TI chip is supposed to have a actually a small chunk of cesium in it. So it's like an atomic clock, but it's a chip, and it's supposed to be in a package cheap enough that you can integrate it in to replace the clock chips on modern PCs. Sadly, it hasn't shown up yet. So that is a potential fix. But the GPS is nice. So like when I did a test, I wanted to go and find out what the real latency was over a point-to-point microwave link. I actually had GPS synchronized test gear from AdTech in Honolulu, and it was accurate enough that I could actually measure the accuracy, how fast was the microwave link. Can't do that with any other technology, so that's going to be interesting. And even my underwater observatories, even though they can't see GPS satellites, they use GPS fed from land over the network using a new version of a network time protocol called IEEE 1588 Precision Time Protocol, where instead of having only a 1 pulse per second clock, I can now get accuracy down into the microsecond range. And another variation is being done. I can't remember the name anymore, but the folks at CERN Laboratories are using it to use with their colliders, and those are down to nanosecond resolution over the network. So yeah, that cascade effect could get really, really big because there's an awful lot of things, cell phones, authentication, Active Directory, and things like that. If the clocks are too far off, things start breaking. I've actually had an Active Directory that wouldn't let me log in because the clocks on the servers were too far off. Bummer.
I do want to point that out. That's a good point because there are a lot of enterprise features that take advantage of GPS. They add new features and they say, hey, we're going to use GPS to help with not only the clock synchronization, but also location-based data and geolocatable data. Now, Curtis, I want to throw this to you. Do you think that this is something that maybe enterprises shouldn't be doing? Is that irresponsible? It's just because it's potentially GPS is free, it's easy to implement, it's easy to put in their systems and build out new features around it. But that doesn't mean it's the best thing to do, especially since now we're seeing how vulnerable it is. So what do you think? Is this irresponsible? Is it something they should be doing, or is it, like Cheever said, add some fail-safe in there and you should be good to go?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Brian on this one. The fact is that for many, many applications, especially when you get into the directional and guidance side of things, there aren't low-cost, easy-to-implement alternatives. You might as well go ahead, use GPS, but recognize that it can be spoofed, it can be attacked, and basically train your users to use a little bit of common sense. There was a great example of this a couple of years ago when what is now generally acknowledged to be a Russian GPS spoofing attack left a bunch of sea captains seeing their GPS show their large container ships sitting about 20 miles inland. So they knew that this wasn't the case, and they reacted accordingly. Everyone should be encouraged to do exactly the same. When it comes to timekeeping, once again, feel free to use GPS. It's accurate, it's fast, it's almost universally available, but make sure you have some sort of backup, whether that's a highly accurate on-site timekeeping device or a consistent link back to one of the universal time codes. Have a backup. It's advice that's good in so very many areas of enterprise IT.
All right, redundancy, very important. Cheever, I want to throw the last question to you, especially around redundancy when it comes to networks and even cell networks and towers. What is there redundancy around here? Like, obviously they're using GPS for this whole synchronization model, but what is the alternative here? And Curtis alluded to a couple there, but from network timing to other server timing, so on and so forth, is there really a good alternative here that's safe and reliable for organizations to depend on?
Well, when you start talking about cell phone networks, one of the tricks that came up when we were doing some work for NATO was we literally laid fiber between dedicated cell towers. And so I actually had an atomic clock in my van, and I used that instead of GPS because, you know, we didn't want to have all our eggs in one basket. So they do exist. You can buy an atomic clock. They're not going to be as accurate as the one in Colorado, but they aren't bad. Now, keep in mind, just because your clock is a few seconds off or even a minute off doesn't mean that your authentication is going to break. I think the last time I actually tried this, the magic number I think was 3 minutes before Active Directory barfed all over me. It's one of those weird things. We actually discovered it. Actually, it was Wayne Rash and I that figured it out during a identity management shootout back in my lab in Honolulu, and that was kind of an eye-opener because it wasn't really discussed in polite company very often. But I think people need to understand if authentication starts failing, especially, you know, if it's odd, it worked before, check your clock, because for some reason or another, I've actually seen some, I'm not sure if I'd call it malware, maybe it's brokenware is a better description, where apps accidentally have changed the clock on my PC. You know, basically what it was is it changed the time zone, and it just kind of broke. So yeah, someday, if anyone from TI is listening, could someone contact me at chibert@twit.tv? What happened to your atomic clock chip? I saw I think it was in Science Magazine or something like that, about 4 years ago. And I'm wondering what happened to that product, because that would solve an amazing number of problems, especially for cell phone operators.
Right. Thanks, Cheebert. Definitely redundancy, and backup is a lesson learned here, especially when it comes to GPS.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was This Week in Enterprise Tech 420, talking about GPS security and our dependence on it. They were discussing an article by Greg Milner in the New Yorker about how vulnerable is GPS, and that was hosted by Drew Maresca, principal engineer at Microsoft, and Curtis Franklin, darkreading.com, and Brian Chi, Skyfiber Net Architect. So, yeah, this is an example of something that is developed in a low or no security context like GPS, and then it becomes a dependency for other technologies and a single point of failure for them in a higher security point. Now, they started off GPS like there was the military, non-military version of it, and so there was a little flux in the location accuracy on the civilian GPS, but they had some extra satellites with encrypted signals for the high precision. So this is potentially used by missiles and such, at one level. And they specifically didn't want the civilian version to be able to be used that way. But there's all these points that it is used for. It's kind of a little surprising to think that a sabotage of GPS, which is, again, an unencrypted signal that can be easily overridden with a local transmitter, that could have implications for power systems, finance, encryption, farmer operations, road grading, and lots more, using the clock as well as the location. And one of the abuses of GPS is, if you know how the signals are encoded, you simply send a more powerful signal locally that claims to be from the satellites, and by implication you can tell it, oh, you're 50 feet north of where you think you are, and so that then makes it go to the south to compensate, for example. So you could actually, to a certain degree, control something that's dependent on GPS by manipulating the GPS signal. And even things like Windows Active Directory, if you have more than a 3-minute difference in times, that can cause the authentication to fail. There's all these, another thing that's sort of implicated in this is when you have things that rarely fail but are tightly coupled. So that's another design problem, not just that the underlying thing is insecure, but that the things built on top of it generally don't fail gracefully. And sometimes they do have a backup system. There's other global location systems. The Russians have one. And, there's other things you can do, like with, as they said, with a compass and other sort of landmarks. You can, to a certain degree, you can tell where you are just by a map of what access points are visible to you in an urban area. So, there are some checksums you can do on this stuff. But design for failure on things that you don't control, and beware of stacking high security things on low security. And cell phones, text messages is another example of that, where it becomes a second factor authentication and then a way of actually resetting passwords. And it's really a fairly easy system to subvert. There's just like a legion of ways to do so. Because it wasn't built with high security in mind. So just, we have to train our, as I say again, user awareness so that you can see the signs that something isn't right, something's going wrong, even when you haven't designed your systems properly, which is, another problem. All right, enough on that. Let's move on to the next topic. This is a clip from twit.tv. This is Tech News Weekly 160, new temporary fleets abuse on Twitter.
This is Twit.
if you have been using Twitter, particularly on mobile, because I don't think we have it on the web yet, at least I haven't noticed it on the web, just mobile. It rolled out a new feature this week. Everybody seems to have an opinion about it because it's kind of impossible to avoid. It's called Fleets. And Palmer Hosh, who's the digital culture reporter at Insider, joins us to talk about it. Welcome to the show, Palmer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. I'm happy that you could take some time with us today. So thank you. And I was really I knew I wanted to get this story on today's show, but I wanted to find an interesting angle that isn't just, change is hard. I don't like it. I like it. Your article kind of got me really thinking about kind of maybe the potential downsides to this feature. But first, before we kind of go there, tell us a little bit about how this works. Fleets, what is it designed to do? How does it work? Are you enjoying it? What do you think?
Yeah, right. So Fleets are kind of Twitter's answer or response to the stories format that's taken over a lot of other social media platforms and was really pioneered by Snapchat. And so Fleets are essentially more ephemeral posts that only last for about 24 hours, and they appear at the top of your timeline from different mutuals, people that you follow on Twitter. And so they could be images, videos, reposts of your tweets or someone else's, or just text. And so basically they're short-term posts that don't necessarily, or they're not intended to have the same kind of permanence or public visibility as a tweet. So you can see fleets from people that you follow. They also appear on your profile. Someone can click on your profile picture and choose whether to view the photo or your set of fleets. And so that's essentially what the feature is. So if you are familiar with Instagram's stories or Snapchat's, fleets will be a very familiar format to you.
Yeah, it seems like they're all doing their own version of this. So it was really only a matter of time before Twitter got in on this as well. Twitter specifically called this a low pressure way for people to talk about what's happening. Low pressure. What is low pressure about this by comparison to what Twitter is all about? Is it the short life cycle of a fleet compared to a tweet that could last for as long as you like until you delete it? Is that why?
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. And I also think the thing about fleets in particular is that it does feel a lot more insular than other types of posting. And so with a fleet, it's something that only your followers are going to automatically see. And it's not necessarily limited to only people who follow you, but they're the people of which for whom that content is going to be automatically displayed to. And it's something that you kind of it's not necessarily something that will show up on your timeline within the feed itself. Rather, you have to click on it and you have to find it. And so I think the ephemerality of it is a big part of it, but also the fact that it feels like, even if it's not necessarily true, you might be posting to a sort of smaller audience. And so I think in that way, particularly in the ways that it's reminiscent of Instagram, it feels a little bit more personal. And of course, you don't have to worry that someone's going to necessarily publicly search for keywords and find your tweet that's outside of your normal circle. It's not quite as public in that way. And so I think that's a lot of it. And that's why it's a little less pressure. So personally, I tend to keep my Twitter somewhat professional, but for example, I'm really into K-pop. And so my first fleet was just a funny post about a K-pop artist that I really like that I might not have necessarily just put on my timeline. And so I think that's something that fleets have in terms of being perceived or marketed by Twitter as a low pressure posting option.
Yeah, it's like business in front, party in back. It's kind of like the mullet of social media.
Yeah, I like that. Fleets are the mullet of Twitter.
All right. So what you were talking about there, as far as this kind of this inability to really search into fleets, it's like they exist outside of the normal mechanisms of Twitter, seems to touch on what the crux of your article is at insider.com. You write about that lack of notification when someone's fleet or someone's tweet rather is fleeted. So many eats. How that could potentially at some point lead to becoming an effective tool for harassment. In other words, someone's tweet could be taken out of context or fleeted. That person whose tweet was fleeted would not know that it happened, and there could be a harassment conversation happening behind the scenes that they are completely unaware of. Am I summarizing that accurately? What does that look like?
Yeah, so essentially one of the concerns that I saw people raising immediately when fleets started to roll out was that, for example, you can post your own fleet to your story, which is something that people do on Instagram with their own posts and things like that. But you can also fleet someone else's tweets. And so that looks like you go to their profile or you see the tweet on a timeline, and you can choose to just repost that onto, I guess, for lack of a better word, your fleet story. And so that was something that people raised a concern about, because you don't receive a notification when someone fleets your tweet. And so in some cases that could potentially be harmless. It's kind of comparable to if someone, say, screenshotted your tweets and posted it as an image, you wouldn't know in that situation, or if someone quote retweeted it from a private account. But people kind of raised the alarm about this because they felt that if, for example, you are a smaller account and someone finds your tweet and reposts it to potentially thousands of followers and has a poor opinion, if you are a follower of that person with a larger following, you could click through, hit the original poster's tweet, and then find their account. And if there's a sudden influx of interactions or potentially derogatory comments, that could be something that would be largely invisible. You wouldn't know necessarily where it was coming from. And so what I saw was people raising concerns about brigading in that sort of scenario, when someone potentially would direct followers to harass a person or comment on a certain tweet. And the concern inherent in that is just that it's invisible and you wouldn't necessarily be able to notify the source. And Twitter did confirm to me in a statement that those notifications weren't present, but that they were something that Twitter was working on. So I think they are kind of aware potentially of some of those criticisms as well.
It's not like Twitter hasn't been in this situation a million times before. And, we've been trying to get them to learn that lesson repeatedly. Thankfully, they've improved things, but it's taken a lot of pain to get there before those changes. So I would be really surprised if they weren't at least, pressed up against this as a potential way of misuse of this feature. And hopefully they roll that out soon. How is this kind of stuff handled on other platforms? Because like we say, this is not a new feature necessarily. This is just Twitter's version of that kind of feature. Are other platforms doing things to prevent this type of kind of back channel harassment from happening? And how does that work?
As far as I know, I'm not super familiar with Instagram's terms of service, but I do know that, like, in terms of, I'm sure it goes against their terms of service or rules. But I think, like, the distinction there that people were talking about is there was one tweet from a user who was kind of addressing some of those, like, well, other platforms allow you to do this, why is it different in this case? And I think something that's inherent to any kind of social media user or anyone in the tech space looking at these kinds of, like, regulation and harassment, like, Instagram and Twitter are very, very different platforms. And while harassment is inherent and present on Instagram, on Twitter, it's a bit of a different phenomenon. And so I think, like, a lot of these platforms, Twitter included, do, like, disavow this kind of behavior within their terms of service or their rules for users. But as far as I know, Instagram, on the same hand, also doesn't give the same kind of notification if someone reposts one of your posts on their story. And so as far as I know, those sorts of concerns haven't necessarily been raised in the same kind of, like, very quick fashion. And I think that's also because this has been, like, a long-standing feature on Instagram for a while. But I think, like, the growing sentiment among people who were tweeting about this yesterday was that Twitter is a radically different site. And has had such a storied history with harassment that it's been trying to address for years. And so other platforms allow the behavior, but I do think, or allow, not the harassment behavior, but allow you to repost other stories or other posts onto your stories. But Twitter is a platform where I think people feel that it should be taken with more caution.
Yeah, history has proven. And then as far as reporting something like this, if there is harassment happening within a fleet, like, is that just handled the same way using the same kind of harassment tools that Twitter already reports? Do they make that easy for someone to do?
Yeah, so I actually tested this yesterday. You can report a fleet, and any kinds of these behavior, whether it's targeted harassment, directing followers to go harass somebody, like that is all still prevented under Twitter's rules. And it is possible and fairly simple to be able to report a fleet. So in that way, it's very similar to objectionable content or content that violates Twitter's rules in normal tweets as well.
Right. Good. Okay. Well, then, hopefully we see some more meaningful changes here. At the very least, I think what I fall back on is if someone is taking my tweet and making a comment on it on Twitter, I want to have the ability to kind of like see what those comments are. Like, I totally agree. Everybody can have different opinions on certain things, but when it comes down to a hidden active harassment strategy that's happening against a particular person, like if I'm the target of that, I definitely want to have the tools or the ability to be able to know that is happening, so that it's not hidden from me, so that there isn't like this war happening behind the scenes against me in a harassing process, in a harassment process. And that, so some sort of notification needs to be there. Kind of surprising that Twitter doesn't have it at launch, but I guess these companies are very used to launching products before they're 100% fully baked, or maybe they didn't think about this initially. I don't know. I find that kind of hard to believe.
I know. That's something that I think a lot of other people were expressing, because they were like, why would Twitter launch a feature that could potentially make the harassment that I receive on this website, not me personally, but generally that people receive on on Twitter, so much worse? And I think that's really the crux of it. What you said is, obviously people are combative on Twitter already, and people can already amplify others' content to large audiences through quote retweets and things like that would already direct their followers to wherever it's coming from. But like you said, in that case, you do know where it's coming from and you can identify a source and hopefully mitigate it. But with fleets, that notification just isn't there.
Yeah, not yet anyways.
Not yet.
We'll be waiting for that to happen, hopefully sometime soon.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was Tech News Weekly 160, talking about the new Twitter fleets and their abuse with Jason Howell and Palmer Hosh of Insider.com. So yeah, this is, again, the kind of an alternative to the stories feature that's on Facebook and other social sites. 24 hours top of timeline. Only your followers will automatically see. It's not in your regular timeline and doesn't show up on search. I like the phrase mullet of Twitter. So it's, it's business in the front and party in the back. But it's also one of the things when you introduce a new technology, you have to be aware of how it interacts with the past bits of technology and with the usage patterns of your users. Twitter is already kind of a place that is prone to lots of abusive comments. Technically, there's beyond a certain point, it's against the terms of service, and they'll delete accounts, but it's kind of in the culture. So when you give something that, where you can talk about somebody with no alerts given to the person, yes, that is a feature that's going to make it easier to organize people to harass someone. You can take someone's regular tweet and do a temporary fleet comment on it in your own stream to your own followers, and the original poster will not see it. And you can, take that tweet out of context. You can get people all riled up, and then they suddenly have all these, if you're someone with a lot of followers, you suddenly have this storm of people going after maybe someone who's relatively small fry, and they have no idea where it's coming from. Because again, it's not even in search, so you can't search for, what this common vector is. It makes it very difficult. So, this is, they say Twitter's working on it, And that also is another unfortunate feature of the tech industry, which is, throw stuff out there, beta test with real people getting real injuries, and then we'll fix it. So it starts out as not fit for purpose, and then they let, because testing is expensive in staff time. So fine, we'll just get the so-called users to test for us for free. And, hey, no consequences to us of anything that goes wrong when we didn't do any due diligence because we're not expected to. That's one of the problems with big tech right now is, they do things that can affect a lot of people in a really profound way, and yet they have no liability for that. So there's no reason for them to be careful with that power. So I hope that, it's inevitable that eventually either the rules will clamp down so hard and that too much regulation is a problem too, because the big guys that are already in have the money to meet the requirements of the regulation, but new potential entrants into the field generally do not. You basically create barriers of entry for competitors, and then you wind up with a monopoly situation. So that's overregulation creates a problem worse than no regulation sometimes. All right, one last clip before we finish up here. Let's go to this one from twit.tv, Creative Commons. This Week in Tech 798, 2 diverging models of computation.
This is Twit.
Unless you're on a computer for 22 hours straight, battery life is going to be a lot more personal. I think the thing that made me sit up and pay attention was actually in TechCrunch, where the reviewer said, "Oh, this thing works like an iPad."
Matthew Panzerino, yeah.
Yeah, and then said the click is responsive, every interaction is immediate, it feels like an iOS device in the best way. And the reason I thought that was really important is because it points to a trend that we're actually seeing on the Windows side too, which is the notion that computing is not going to be based on the model that we're used to, where the keyboard and the mouse are your primary sources of input and data manipulation and data access. We're moving to a model where it's going to be tactile and immediate, and you and your data are going to flow between your mobile device and your laptop device and back and forth. And I thought it was interesting that Apple is massaging and amplifying user expectations for a shift that's already in progress, and a shift that's already been happening with people who are hardcore Surface users for quite a while.
And there's also, it feels like to some degree Microsoft prepared for this in an interesting way, because starting next year, they're going to be selling a product where you're not even running Windows locally. You're running it in the cloud.
Yeah, no, desktop as a service is a huge and growing market for enterprise folks. And it's gotten a real boost from, 2020, because when any enterprise is faced with having to support people virtually, instead of being able to just like walk over and see why somebody is hitting the restart button repeatedly and not getting to ring it up, DAAS, it's just, you can pop in, see what they're doing, reconfigure things, reboot it for them, get it going. And, Microsoft was, I guess the best way to put it is, Microsoft's like, yes, this is going to be a thing. Yes, they've already got a really strong cloud-based position, and they've seen phenomenal growth in their cloud-based services for the enterprise, like not just Azure. We're talking like Office 365 has been great for them too. And this is another logical outgrowth of that, where
if I
get a customer to pay for a service rather than a license.
Yeah. If I can play Cyberpunk 2077 on an Android phone or a Chromebook, on Google Stadia, why the hell do I need to have Windows running on a machine?
Yeah, exactly.
Which, in some ways, it almost feels like Apple might have made a strategic mistake. They focused on making a more powerful desktop, while Microsoft focused on running wherever you are, right?
But are they really aiming at the same audience? For all that we're sitting here talking about this, a lot of Microsoft's bread and butter is in really almost boring we run the world type places like hospital offices
Right.
or school administrations,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
And Apple's done a really good job of colonizing a much different set of offices and industry verticals. So I don't know if you can necessarily compare them one-to-one anymore. They're very different companies in a lot of ways. Microsoft makes an increasing percentage of its revenue quarter over quarter based on cloud-based services and data manipulation, whereas Apple is beginning to move into consumer-based services and emphasis on wearables and phones and things like that.
So maybe
You can't really do business parity, in my opinion. They're both part of like a personal computing ecosystem, but they have very different functions. I mean, it's the same thing. You can have, to use another metaphor, you can have like your KitchenAid mixer and you can have your coffee maker, and both of them can be beautifully designed and do what they're going to do, but you can't interchange them. You can't make coffee in a 5-quart mixer.
Nobody says, gee, I wish I had a burr grinder in my KitchenAid. It's not, So maybe it's better to say, instead of an inflection point, where we're at a fork in the road, where computing is going to take two different directions. Is that a fair?
Now, bear in mind, this is just a personal opinion, and this is also based on, watching trends in the enterprise and things like that. If you are an end user, you're probably going to conceive of computing as, this is the collection of data and experiences and apps that are in my personal cloud, and I access them through any one of a wide variety of hardware devices. For the companies, it's going to be a slightly different relationship where they're like, these are going to be the services we offer, and these are the devices and appliances we offer, and these are the configurations we offer. And you're not going to have people locked into different platforms. You're going to have them maybe locked into different services based on how easy it is to move their stuff around and access it. But if somebody's an Apple partisan, it's not, I only store things in iCloud. I never use Google Drive or Gmail. Like, that's just not how it works.
No, it isn't. No, exactly. And actually, Lori, it may not be a bad thing if I have an Apple computer as a consumer for my stuff that I'm doing locally, and it's my product. There's been a lot of questions. Well, what about Boot Camp? Will I be able to run Windows on this? In fact, in the Ars Technica article, I think Craig Federighi said, that's up to Microsoft. They got to figure that out. We're not going to. It's not our job to get Windows running on our new Macintoshes. Maybe the answer is I don't run Windows on my Macintosh. I run Windows Virtual Desktop in a browser, and now I have everything I want. I have a cloud. I have Windows. I have a personal device that is aesthetic and beautiful and powerful. I get everything I want. Is that?
I haven't used a virtual machine yet. I'm testing out the MacBook Pro right now, and one of the things I need to do is test out a virtual machine on it. But from what I understand, the issues with other Macs having a little bit of lag using virtual machines goes away completely with the M1 chip.
Right.
So, that's the pain point that people would say, well, that I use Boot Camp because I don't like the Mac operating system. I want the hardware that is the Mac, but I want the software that is Windows. And, let's see, maybe the virtual machine is the solution to that, at least temporarily, while Boot Camp is not, working for the M1 chip.
Lisa, does Windows Virtual Desktop run? It runs in a browser, right? You would just or do you have a client app? How does that work? Do you know?
You asked me, and I haven't actually had any hands-on time with it.
Well, nobody has. It comes out next year. I mean, I would, in theory, you could run it in a browser. Here's what I find really interesting. While a number of manufacturers, including Microsoft, have been, said, well, we're going to embrace the M1 chip, but we're not going to do it right away, or, Office is currently in beta. Google, within days, said, oh, here's Chrome. And I thought about it, and I realized that's actually because I think Google sees Chrome as the window into Windows Virtual Desktop. I know they see Chrome as the window into Stadia. People complain, oh, my M1 is not going to play video games. It doesn't have a discrete GPU. Who cares? You're going to be running. When that hit me, I thought, I don't have to worry about native games on my Mac, on my new Mac, because I'm going to run Chrome native, and it's going to use WebAssembly or whatever technologies, PWA technologies it uses, and I can play Fortnite. I could play. Pre-ordered Cyberpunk 2077. I could play all of that. Because it's not running on the machine, it's running in the cloud. I'm streaming it to a browser. I think that's, to me, That's why I think this is a sea change, and I don't know what it's going to how it's going to shake out, but I think you actually you nailed it, Lisa, by saying there's a personal thing, like my wristwatch is or a piece of jewelry is a personal object, a commodity that's mine, my phone, but it's a window into a larger tool set that is actually probably in the cloud, much of it, right? And this is Microsoft's perfectly positioned for that.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was This Week in Tech 798, 2 models of computing. That was with host Leo Laporte and guest Lisa Schmeisser from IT Pro Today, editor, and also Lori Gill, the managing editor of iMore. So, yeah, this is, we talked a bit about virtualizing the browser. There was a service that was doing that, and I thought that was kind of an ideal way to do it because the browser has kind of become its own operating system. And here they're talking about, well, through the browser you can access a virtual desktop environment through something like Microsoft, and you don't have to worry about where all your personal files are. They're on the cloud. You can access them from wherever you want to be. And Apple kind of moving into more consumer services, and just by all accounts really knocked it out of the park with the new M1 processor. So the things you can do on your desktop with, voluminous data is pretty impressive. But they're kind of moving into consumer services. So what is the join here? Okay, so, maybe locally you're using something that's highly secure, but then you're virtualizing your desktop through Microsoft. I mean, we already use a lot of different services. Whatever platform you're on, you probably use some Google services. A lot of people use Dropbox. There's just these things that these solutions we kind of stitch together. If they're kind of isolated features, if we can do so, we like to take the best of breed and stitch them together. And often to enhance their appeal, they will, make it easy to integrate them with the dominant players of Microsoft or Apple. These are, this is kind of the future. And in one level, it's like, oh, yeah, this is really neat. You can have access to your stuff anywhere. You could access it from your phone. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to worry about losing your files if you lose a laptop. But at the same time, we're in an environment where our privacy, our autonomy, our ability to have a say in our own destiny and the use of our data is decreasing. And in an environment where governments do not respect our privacy in the cloud, the tendency of these platforms to more and more try to force you to put your data in the cloud, or even just a backup of it. I don't use iCloud, and I keep getting these prompts to log into iCloud so you can back up all your stuff. It's like, so I can put all my private data in a place where rogue employees or rogue law enforcement people can easily get to it with pretty much no consequences. Easy to abuse and no consequences. And of course, you're creating a big centralized location for hackers to attack. Hackers are not going to attack, 100 million different laptops. That's a lot of work. They let the big guys force all the data be concentrated into one place. And as we talked about earlier in the show, the tendency is not to guard places with proportion to the value of the data inside them, especially if it's someone else's data and you aren't personally affected. You don't have any liability if that data is disclosed. So you do just enough security so that people think their stuff is safe and will hand you their money, but you don't really care about real security, which would generally be, keeping the stuff local and maybe an encrypted version backed up to the cloud, where it was encrypted locally before it was sent to the cloud, and the platform, the company behind the platform, does not have any ability to get into it at all. So, I mean, it seems like what we should be shooting for. There is the balance between the state's need to violate our privacy to investigate crimes. And they can already do that by, coming into our houses or spying on us individually. They certainly have the technology to do so, no matter how much encryption we throw at it. So if they're looking at someone, it's not a problem to get into their stuff. What this stuff that lately has been pushed for, this let's put it all in the cloud and make it really easy to access, that is really about making it very cheap, easy, convenient to violate people's privacy on a massive scale with relative invisibility to the people whose data is being invaded. That's really what they're pushing for when they say, well, let's put it in the cloud where we can, subpoena it or spy on it without any interaction with the person who's the target of the investigation. So you don't have any ability to say, to challenge it, to say, well, why are you going into hundreds of millions of people's private data? No one knows, so they can't challenge it. So this is the kind of the dark side of this very convenient future that we're being offered. So at the very least as a marketing scheme, Apple seems to be, to a degree, trying to support privacy. At least they make it possible. They are pushing for a lack of privacy in trying to force people into iCloud, but by and large, you can turn that off and use all your applications locally. So that's still a possibility. Microsoft, they seem to be moving in the direction of being the self-appointed system admin for your system. They'll decide when you get updates. They'll deactivate things, they'll move things around, and they don't ask, they just do it. They figure out, okay, what solution is going to work for, ideally 99% of the people, but when you have millions of users, 99% is still, 1% of that is still a lot of people being left out in the cold. And that's not even taking into account how sloppy they've gotten on some of their updates lately. They've done updates that put the computer into an endless reboot loop. They've done ones that disabled your ability to print. They've done ones that deleted all the contents of the I believe it was the documents directory. It just crazy show-stopping stuff that should have been caught in testing, but they're not testing anymore, I guess, or at least not enough. They seem to have cut the budget there, or they don't have as good of programmers as they used to, or something, because they didn't used to make these huge errors. And the list of things being, the list of errors being found and requiring patching, that list gets longer and longer as time goes on. It really should be getting shorter, right? You figure, well, once you've worked the bugs out, that list should be getting shorter, right? But there is a imbalance between the striving to add new features and to change things versus making the stuff that is already there work properly. And if you keep adding stuff, then it never settles down. And I suppose one aspect of this is it kind of forces people to, allow updates, right? You literally, if you skip updates for more than a brief amount of time, you're probably going to get hacked. Just because there's these glaring vulnerabilities and that promptly get plugged into automated exploitation tools that scan the planet and just for various reasons get into as many systems as possible. It just could be as simple as they want to have another machine that they can make part of a botnet to attack somebody or relay their, criminal traffic through or something, or more insidiously, maybe they'd specifically want looking through and say, okay, what have you got? What can I exploit of your information? Or maybe just I'll encrypt all your data and charge you ransom to access it again. I don't care what's in there, but you care and you'll pay me money for it. And these are the sorts of things that are left open when you don't really properly care about security, or at least it doesn't seem to be part of your business plan. you're making money fine when the user does not have any security, because the threshold is pretty much, well, you take what we give you, or you won't be using a computer, you won't have compatibility with other business users. So as long as they give you just enough to keep you from Exodus en masse to, to Apple or to Linux or something else, they kind of got you. So we'll see. It's interesting how bad for how long they can get and still keep people, I guess. If they lose the 1% that lose all their data and you're saying, heck with that, I'm not trusting you guys anymore. Well, they still got the other 99% and they haven't lost much, and they didn't spend much on their testing and all that. So financially they came out ahead, which is a shame when you do horrible things and you come out ahead financially, but that's the marketplace we currently have. And that is partly dependent, again, on the users not having the knowledge of what is going on and that it could be better. So be a better user, we'll get better tech. That's the hope. And with that, you've done it again. You spent an hour talking about technology and how better understanding of it can lead to better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. I hope you'll join us to continue this conversation next Wednesday and every Wednesday, noon to 1 o'clock, for Northwest Tech Show.